Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. Thank you very much for joining. And we realized how short notice the registration was available for us, so very excited that you're all able to join us. We got three amazing speakers joining us today. We've got Lee Selka, who's the Principal of Sustainable Outcomes for Healthy Waters at Auckland Council. We also have Olia Alban, who is a PhD researcher with PDP, working in the environment and climate science. And lastly, we will have Chris Leyland, who is the Head of Strategic Procurement with Auckland Council. So to kick things off, we're going to start with Lee. So Lee's part of the Sustainable Outcomes team with Healthy Waters. Department's responsible for supporting the development of resilient water-sensitive communities in Auckland. So she has a legal background with over 16 years experience in the environmental sector, having worked in the UK and the US for non-profit organizations, and she's also a certified sustainability associate with the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. So Lee, I will hand it to you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
I should mention, if you do have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat. We've muted everyone, so Lee's got the floor, but I will be keeping an eye on the chat and pass through any comments or questions as they come through. Sorry, Lee.
No, thanks, Johnny. Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Lee Steckler. As Johnny said, I work for Healthy Waters and the Sustainable Outcomes team, and I'm going to be speaking today about the carbon dashboard. The Auckland region is already starting to feel the effects of a warmer planet. With its 3 harbours and 3,000 kilometres of coastline, Auckland is particularly susceptible to the impacts of rising sea levels, coastal erosion, storm surges and flooding if global emissions stay unchecked. Much has happened in Auckland following the council declaring a climate emergency in 2019. The government has passed the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon legislation, and Auckland has committed to halving its emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Balanced against these targets, Auckland also needs to deliver critical infrastructure, addressing historic underinvestment and a rapidly growing population, which is expected to grow to 2.3 million by 2048. A budget of $452 million has been allocated for stormwater infrastructure. Building infrastructure means that carbon will be emitted. Studies have shown worldwide that carbon associated with materials and construction processes account for around 11% of all global carbon emissions. Despite this, no simple, universal tool exists in New Zealand that enables people to undertake simple carbon assessments of infrastructure programs. Without a consistent tool, carbon reduction targets may not be met. A city can't manage what it can't measure. Current initiatives to reduce carbon have focused on reducing operational carbon, the carbon that comes from energy, heat and lighting, with carbon associated with infrastructure construction, or embodied carbon, being largely overlooked. Embodied carbon is the carbon emissions associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building. So it includes carbon created during the manufacturing, transporting to site and construction practices used. It'll also cover decommissioning of a building at its end of life. At the very beginning of a project's life, designers have the greatest ability to influence carbon. The options are to build nothing, build less, or build clever and efficiently. Once the project commences, the ability to influence carbon reduces. With this in mind, Healthy Waters began work with the global engineering firm Mott MacDonald to design a digital carbon tool to enable it to measure and account for carbon emissions associated with its stormwater infrastructure projects. The tool has been designed to hold emission data on a number of projects so that managers and decision makers have the information necessary to make informed decisions about an entire work program. The dashboard allows viewers to look at information from a project level to a program level during different time periods and project phases. The dashboard shown in this slide contains a portfolio view where you can see a number of projects have been entered into the portal, and when you hover over a project, you can see its impact. This view of the dashboard is an internal-facing view for project leaders and decision makers. As you can see, the dashboard shows the net carbon over time and the breakdown of operational and embodied carbon. Diving deeper into the portal to the design view level, the tool will be able to make a quick assessment of carbon emissions associated with different processes. In this example, you can see how a decision to use a trenchless method to install a pipe emitted 3 times less carbon than a concrete solution. These types of calculations mean that the true cost of carbon can be assessed. It has been recognised that carbon cannot be designed out of all our projects, so it was important that the dashboard also showed the amount of carbon to be offset or sequestered. Our next speaker is going to provide further details about the opportunities for sequestration in Auckland, but from surveys undertaken with residents, they want transparency and they want to see a live account of the council's carbon footprint. This will be demonstrated via another layer in the dashboard, which is proposed to show a type of heat map, allowing users to see where in Auckland carbon is being emitted and where it is being sequestered. We have now taken a prototype of the dashboard to the world stage in the form of the Bloomberg Philanthropies 2021 Global Mayor's Challenge. In March this year, the Mayor selected the dashboard as Auckland's entry into the competition. Michael Bloomberg, former Mayor of New York, has a long legacy of climate action and currently sits as the board president of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, of which Auckland is a member. Through Bloomberg Philanthropies, millions of dollars has been funneled into climate programs around the world, including a recent $10.5 million commitment in support of strengthening climate capacity ahead of COP26, which is due to be held in Glasgow at the end of this month. 631 cities from around the world submitted applications, and Auckland was selected by the Bloomberg Committee of Experts as one of 50 cities with the most innovative idea. From those 50 cities, 15 will be selected to win a grand prize of US $1 million each to help implement their idea, to scale it, and ultimately transfer it to other cities across the globe. Auckland's application was lodged under the Climate and Environment theme, which focuses on tackling the root causes and effects of climate change. As seen from the world map, the 50 champion cities range from across the globe and include an entry also from our friends in Wellington in the same category, no less. Final submission is due at the end of this month, so the team are working furiously to finalise our application. As part of being a finalist, Bloomberg have provided their experts to support Auckland during this champion city phase. And being part of this process has notably challenged our team to think more broadly on our approach and the way we configure our tool, which has gone well beyond our initial idea. What is our vision for this tool? Short term, all Auckland Council infrastructure projects would use the carbon dashboard, enabling their carbon footprint to be reduced at each life cycle stage. Designers and suppliers will be given access to the tool to enable scrutiny and challenge and drive innovation towards low carbon solutions. In the longer term, we would look to roll out the dashboard to other cities around New Zealand, enabling the country to work together to reach the required carbon reductions. Through the Bloomberg Challenge, funding and support will be provided to help accelerate the development of this tool. But whether we win or not, Auckland Council is committed to leading development of the dashboard. It is an exciting time for Auckland, and Healthy Waters is very proud to be leading this project.
Is that yourself, Lee?
That's me.
Amazing. Thank you very much. That is great.
Yeah.
I'm personally very, very excited about this initiative, and lots of rounds of applause. So a lot of you are as well. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We'd love to answer it and help you out. So, Olia, when is the Bloomberg submission go in?
It's going in on the 31st of October.
Oh, so 2 weeks away.
2 weeks ago, yes.
And when do you find out if you're successful?
I think we'll find out we'll get a nod maybe in December, and it will be officially announced in next year, start of next year.
And I presume the initiative will live regardless of the outcome of the Bloomberg competition.
Yeah, absolutely. The money would be an amazing nice to have. It would mean a faster, quicker rollout, and all the support that you get with that money comes with it over a 3-year period. But regardless of that, Auckland Council is pursuing the dashboard, and we are looking forward to rolling it out.
Awesome. No, that's super exciting. Thank you very much. We've got some questions, if you don't mind. So the first question is, could it be used for buildings, basically?
Yeah, any new infrastructure, it's got the layers are available for you to just do it as a single project assessment, or if you had a group of buildings that you wanted to assess as part of a program, you could apply the dashboard to those sort of types of projects as well.
I guess that sort of answers the other questions as will other people be able to use the carbon dashboard?
Yeah, it is anticipated that it will be something that will be utilised widely by the industry.
Cool. And last question. How can other organisations best support Auckland Council with success in this space to decarbonise?
Again, we are working hard with all of the industry to ensure that we're all on the same page when it comes to reducing carbon. So we're all about pursuing innovative ideas that are low carbon. Our philosophy is always, do we need something? If we do, can we do it less? And then can we do it the most efficient way possible? And I think that, the industry is aware of that, and carbon has to be taken into account in any new infrastructure builds, because if we don't start mitigating it, we're never going to reach our targets. And the residents of Auckland, they've given us a mandate to lead on this, and we are really pursuing it.
Amazing, thank you. There is a few other questions, but we'll move on to the next presentation, and if we've got time at the end, we can come back and answer. So by all means, if there is other questions, please put them in, and we can come back and with whatever time we've got left at the end, we can go through some more, if that's okay, Lee?
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right, well, next we have Olia Alban. So Olia is a PhD researcher doing research into blue carbon sequestration here in New Zealand. So she works for PDP. So she's a scientist with passion, which you'll soon hear, on all things climate and biodiversity. So once she completed her original studies, she worked as a research assistant with the Antarctic Research Centre. So she, once finished with that, she's braved the consulting world, moved into PDP, where she still is with, and has moved with an interest into coastal wetland management and protection. So pursuing this interest further, this has turned into the PhD project. So Olia currently splits her time between the research, consulting, and sharing her enthusiasm for nature-based solutions for climate change, mitigation, and adoption. Olia, thank you very much for your time, and I will hand to you.
Kia ora, thanks, Johnny. So following on from Lee's presentation, this talk will focus on carbon sequestration, particularly in the coastal environment. I will be talking about some case studies in Northland and the Thames. Sorry, Auckland, but that may be next. So carbon sequestration, as Lee's mentioned, is a component of the carbon dashboard that's currently been investigated by the Auckland Council team. What is carbon sequestration? Carbon sequestration is the ability of an ecosystem, be it vegetation, soils, or oceans, to trap and store carbon. These ecosystems are collectively referred to as carbon sinks, and to name a few include our forests, peatlands, and coastal wetlands. The pie chart shows that globally, they remove around 5.5 gigatons of carbon per year from the atmosphere. But there is still huge gaps in our understanding of the rates and permanence of carbon sequestration, and whether some of these ecosystems may in fact be sources of greenhouse gases. For example, wetlands can act as both sinks and sources of atmospheric carbon, and that carbon budget varies significantly with region and wetland type, like freshwater versus marine, and environmental conditions, age, and management of the ecosystem also exert a strong influence on its ability to sequester carbon. Another example, recent studies indicate that restored coastal wetlands can take anywhere between 2 to 100 years to switch from carbon sources to sinks. And again, that varies significantly based on the geographic region. Research efforts on coastal ecosystem carbon sequestration are underway in New Zealand and include research on mangroves, seaweed farming, and kelp forests. But with climate change and human activities driving ecosystem degradation, these natural carbon sinks are also under threat. For example, recent studies have revealed that the Brazilian Amazon is now a carbon source, and 95% of kelp forests around Tasmania have been wiped out by warming waters. Coastal wetlands continue to be destroyed as a result of coastal development and are also vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme weather events. And when these carbon stocks are damaged, they may switch from sinks to sources of greenhouse gases. So to really understand and utilize the carbon sequestration of our natural ecosystems, we not only need to understand the processes that drive the capture and storage of carbon, but also how these processes will be affected with climate change and the types of mitigation and adaptation strategies we need to deploy to safeguard these ecosystems in the future. Okay, so let's talk about carbon sequestration in coastal wetlands. Coastal wetlands can be broken down into 3 environments: mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. And collectively, they're referred to as blue carbon ecosystems. For my PhD research, I'm focusing on salt marshes. Salt marshes can store up to 40 times more carbon than terrestrial forests. So instead of trees that may sequester carbon for between 20 to 100 years, in salt marshes, it can be on millennia timescales, as the carbon is locked away in the soils due to the high productivity of the salt marsh, rapid burial rates, and low levels of microbial activity in the soil that preserve that organic carbon. In New Zealand, 90% of wetlands have been lost as a result of coastal development and conversion to agricultural land. A recent study used data collected from mangrove and salt marsh sites outside of New Zealand to estimate the remaining mangrove and salt marshes in New Zealand, what they could sequester in New Zealand, and they estimated up to 95,000 tons of carbon per year. But this needs to be verified through local case studies. And to just put this into perspective, in 2016, 2.7 million people took a return flight from Auckland to Wellington, and this would have offset approximately 6% of these emissions. The first objective of my research will be to quantify the carbon stocks and sequestration rates across a range of salt marsh sites in Ranunu Harbour and Pokoroko Miranda Reserve. The idea is to compare how these rates vary depending on the site environmental history and existing land use pressures. This will be accomplished by collecting and analyzing soil cores, as you can see in the workflow diagram. To really understand the carbon sequestration potential, we need a lot of data, not just the organic carbon content and burial rates. For example, we need to determine where this carbon originates. Is it marine or terrestrial? And that's where analyses like stable isotopes come in. And this is important because we don't want to incorporate organic carbon that's been derived outside of the study site, but ends up being transported to the salt marsh into our sequestration estimate, because someone else could already be accounting for that carbon in their estimate before it gets transported. It's also worth mentioning that to quantify the net sequestration potential, so whether the site is overall a source or sink of carbon, it's essential to measure greenhouse gas fluxes to understand how much CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide is being released versus sequestered. This is outside the scope of this study, but if anyone out there is interested in getting these measurements, please do get in touch. That would be very, very cool. The second objective of this research is to quantify the sea level rise impacts on saltmarsh sites in Ranunu Harbour in Northland. The idea is to combine the existing hydrodynamic model of the harbour together with a wetland evolution model and the latest sea level rise projections to simulate several coastal management scenarios and effectively assess how the salt marshes are likely to respond to rising sea levels and what that means for carbon sequestration. And this is very important as there is research suggesting that coastal wetlands capture more carbon as sea levels rise, but there are also studies indicating that if sea levels rise too quickly, coastal wetlands will not be able to keep up and will be drowned, effectively releasing their blue carbon stocks back into the atmosphere. In addition to carbon mitigation benefits, coastal wetlands provide protection from storm surge and sea level rise. The use of coastal wetlands in hybrid flood defenses is well documented in literature. The diagram in the slide illustrates the benefit of reinstating a salt marsh, which can work in conjunction with human defenses like seawalls. So simply rebuilding a seawall after it's been breached is not a viable long-term solution, but reinstating a salt marsh will provide longer-term protection. So our lost wetlands could actually be part of the managed retreat solution. The third objective of this research is to investigate potential voluntary and national market access to carbon resilience and biodiversity programs for coastal wetlands in New Zealand. There are already established voluntary carbon market schemes for coastal wetlands like Vera, and a resilience credit scheme is also currently being developed. There are several biodiversity disclosure guidelines currently in preparation, for example, by TNFD, and that stands for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And disclosures like these are paving the way for future biodiversity credit schemes. So what do we need to do for these ecosystems to be our climate solutions? To include these ecosystems in either national or voluntary schemes, we need data from local case studies and consistent methodologies. And hopefully the increased research interest in this space will do just that. For example, after decades of research in the UK, peatlands have been included in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And in Australia, the first blue carbon method is currently being developed for the Emissions Reduction Fund, which will create opportunities to generate carbon credits from restoration of salt marshes. We need collaboration between research institutions, government, industry, and local communities. For example, the National Citizen Project was launched in Scotland as part of a national study to quantify the blue carbon stocks in salt marshes across the country. And interested people were briefed on the project and given the sample location and sampling equipment. They went out there, collected the samples, which were sent to the laboratory and collated into a national database. That's a really cool collaboration project. I also want to emphasize that coastal wetlands present a key advantage by supplying multiple ecosystem services in addition to carbon sequestration. I mentioned coastal protection earlier, but other services include biodiversity enhancement and recreational activities. There are some enthusiastic birdwatchers out there. A couple of years ago, for the first time in Australia, a Eurasian tufted duck was sighted at a treatment pond in Melbourne. It's this unique looking duck in the slide. And people traveled from all over the country to obtain a birdwatching permit. I think people even traveled outside of Australia to to go see this duck. So we really must have a holistic approach when talking about protection and restoration of our coastal ecosystems for climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, I just want to come back to the carbon dashboard the team at Auckland Council are developing, because tools like these are part of the solution. So once we collect the emission and sequestration data of our ecosystems and green infrastructure and other infrastructure that we talked about, we can store and access this data using tools like these. And then we can go further and use it to support a wide range of land management practices that conserve, restore, or sustainably manage our natural ecosystems and working lands. And here's a great example from the Environment Agency in the state of Delaware. They launched an online GIS mapping tool that prioritizes areas for preservation and restoration of wetlands, riparian zones, terrestrial areas, and stormwater management control. In the picture, the bright orange polygons show the most suitable sites for wetland restoration. So if we know where the existing and potential restoration sites are, and we know the net sequestration potential, this information together can be used to find opportunities for restoration and preservation of our natural ecosystems while contributing to climate mitigation, resilience, and enhancing biodiversity. So to conclude, to fully take advantage of our blue carbon ecosystems, we must invest in the protection and restoration of these habitats. We need local case studies to understand the net sequestration potential using consistent methodologies. We need to understand how these ecosystems are changing with land use pressures and climate change impacts, as there is a considerable risk that removals achieved through sequestration will be released or reversed over time through land management decisions or natural disturbances like extreme weather events. And that means we need to establish resilience building strategies. This is a really great opportunity for researchers, government, industry, and local communities to partner on these projects and establish a level of understanding and trust and put in place the principles and regulations based on scientific data before incorporating these ecosystems into national policy and greenhouse gas reduction schemes. And I'd like to finish off with some acknowledgements. A lot of people have helped me so far in this project. So yeah, thank you to all, especially Richard Levy and Joss Ratcliffe, my PhD advisors. Thank you very much. That's
amazing, Olia. Very, very good work. And the acknowledgements is a really nice way to end. Not one person can solve this. So it's definitely a team effort in all regards. We have a few questions. If you'd like to answer some.
Yeah, I'll try.
So the first one is from Peter Mitchell, and he was asking about carbon sequestration capabilities of natural versus artificial coastal wetlands. So based on your prior comments about the time taken to become sinks means that any artificial wetlands created in the past couple of decades may not contribute to a measurable difference.
Okay, so from what I've read about constructed versus natural wetlands, it really varies on where you are in the world, what type of vegetation you use, what type of substrate for the constructed wetland. There are a couple of studies out there that actually say that the sequestration rates in the constructed wetlands after a couple of years are the same as the natural wetlands. Others say that they're sinks for up to 300 years. Yeah, so it really, really does vary a lot. There is no one number you can apply across even a country. You have to really kind of do case by case. But if you know what the vegetation zones are, right, roughly, if you know what the substrate is in the constructed wetland, and if you've got the numbers for that, if a similar wetland is being constructed somewhere else, sure, go ahead and apply those numbers. But that's where you kind of need to be, well, as thorough as possible before applying those rates.
Cool. Thank you. There's another piece which I do think you have the answer to. It says, is there work so that New Zealand's greenhouse gas inventory can be updated to include the creation of wetlands as a carbon sink instead of just planting pine trees?
There isn't enough in New Zealand, no. Well, there's none in New Zealand, actually. But there are international studies out there, and that's been compiled into the carbon dashboard. So those numbers are being gathered by the Auckland Council team.
Amazing. I'll do one last question. Again, if any other questions, please fire them through and we'll come back to them at the end. Let's see. Someone has asked, where are you based, Olia?
I'm in Wellington.
So Olia gets to go out and about. We're all in home here in Auckland.
I'm sorry.
Cool. Can you outline the importance of avoiding further loss of wetlands, as like creating more carbon emissions versus reinstating those type of environments?
I think what I mentioned before is having a holistic approach, right? So there's no, but we get more emissions if we do this, or we get more sequestration if we do that. I think it needs to be, what are the biodiversity benefits we're going to get? What are the local communities going to get out of it? And then, sequestration versus emissions is also a part of it, but it needs to be this, it's really like the circle of life approach, right? You can't just pick one thing and go, this is why we should do it. Yeah, it needs to be like a full-on assessment to really have a thorough understanding of everything that's happening in the environment. So yeah, to answer the question, I can't really stress what's more important because I think everything is.
Thank you so much, Olia. Okay, and we'll move on to our third and final speaker. Next up, we have Chris Leyland. So Chris is the head of strategic procurement for Auckland Council. So he is a supply chain professional with over 10 years experience leading the transformation programs in New Zealand, UK and Canada. He started his career as an environmental engineer before moving into management consulting, where he's worked with a lot of the world's largest multinational companies on sustainable supply chain program. And he's recently joined Auckland Council, where he's helping them lead their social and environmental procurement agenda. So Chris, thank you very much for your time, and I will hand to you.
Thank you, Johnny, and kia ora, everyone. Great to see you all here today. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Does that work?
That works perfectly.
Brilliant. We got there in the end. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so let's get into it. Yeah, so basically just in the next 20 minutes, what I want to take you guys through is how we can and should be using better sustainable procurement practices, particularly in public procurement. I guess focusing on a slightly more narrow part of the puzzle than what Olia and Lee have presented on, and how we're buying goods and services, but also having a bit of a wider perspective on some of the other environmental and social outcomes we can be delivering. So every year we spend about $600 billion across private and public procurement. Of that, there's about $40 to $50 billion of central government spend. $10 billion of that is that local government spend, and I think Auckland Council Group, inclusive of, I guess, AT and Watercare, is about $3.5 billion. So it's an incredibly large lever for change, whichever way you look at it, right? And one that I think has been sort of largely overlooked until quite recently. The size of these numbers have the potential to shape markets, change industry norms, and realign supply chains to be more environmentally and socially responsible and prepare for a low carbon economy. So the question is, how do we harness this buying power to deliver more positive impact while remaining fiscally responsible to our ratepayers and citizens? We're probably all acutely aware now of some of the biggest challenges that we face in Auckland. And I see, Lee, that we've actually used the same slide, which is pretty funny, with slightly different hexagons, which is good. So, we are in a climate emergency. our waste problem is getting bigger by the year and is anticipated to increase by 50%, well, projected to double in the next 10 years. We've got some rising inequality, unfortunately, in our city, and relatively high rates of unemployment with Māori and Pacifica. And yet, on the flip side, we're suffering from some major skill shortages in areas such as construction and IT. We've got 29% of Aucklanders being Māori or Pacifica ethnicity, yet less than 5% of businesses in Auckland are Māori and Pacifica owned. And we're seeing some major supply chain bottlenecks, right, that you read in the paper every day. And these have really been amplified, I'd say, by an over-reliance on overseas products, materials and imported labour. The markets that we've got today are a reflection of the procurement practices and how we've bought goods and services in the past. And the fact that we're seeing some of these fundamental market issues over-reliance on imported products and labour, concentration of market power and a lack of supply diversity and competition in some areas, some industries with some significant environmental impacts, points really to the fact that we have been largely ignoring some of these wider social and environmental impacts and treating them as externalities, right? Sustainable procurement isn't going to solve all of these challenges, but we need to use it to much better effect, I think. In order to do this, we need to transition away from traditional procurement and the paradigm of price, quality and time to understanding and evaluating the total value we're delivering on a project. Where price, quality and time are still very important, right? But where we start identifying the wider outcomes and impact of what we're creating. For example, what are the job and training opportunities that can be created through this contract? Where is the waste from this project going? And how do we make sure it's not going to go to landfill? How is this project aligned with our nation's carbon reduction commitments? And when you start asking these questions, then your perception of value of money starts to change. And what we are setting out to achieve also starts to change a little, right? It's a little provocative, but I think we're moving away from transactional procurement to community impact creation, which is where we need to head. The good news is that the wheels are in motion for this type of thinking, right? The broader outcomes framework at a central government level was published in 2020, and then mandates sustainable procurement principles for all government agencies, and nearly all of the local government agencies as well now have similar types of sustainability frameworks in place. At Auckland Council, we do have our own sustainable procurement framework, and within that we've identified 5 real key focus areas that we want to lean in, and we have some clear KPIs and organisational targets against all 5 of these areas. And we're quite proud, to be honest, that we are the first New Zealand public entity to have published targets and published reporting against these targets in the sustainable procurement area. So from a procurement, from an environmental perspective, our highest priorities are about reducing carbon and the waste footprints in all of our contracts. And from a social perspective, we have 3 top priorities. These are around improving our supplier diversity, which is around growing our relationships and spend with Māori, Pacifica and social enterprise businesses. Buying more local goods and services, and also about creating quality employment opportunities for targeted and underprivileged communities within our city. So all of these actions will help us create a more climate resilient future, I think. The carbon and waste one's pretty self-explanatory, but equally I think the social objectives are really important towards moving towards a low carbon economy. If we can better share the economic prosperity of our city and create more financially secure citizens, we can empower people to make more sustainable choices for themselves and for their whānau. And so now would like to just give you a bit of a quick overview around some of the things we're doing in these areas. Firstly, starting with our carbon reduction strategy. So for most organisations, I think Scope 3 emissions, which are those indirect emissions created in your value chain, are pretty largely unknown and unmitigated. And this is obviously due to a combination of the reporting being voluntary but also just the sheer enormity of the task of trying to understand the carbon in your supply chain. However, I think if we're going to tackle climate change head on, we really need to start addressing Scope 3 emissions, particularly as they typically represent 80% of an organisation's total emissions. It's even more important for us as Auckland Council because we're not only responsible for delivering our carbon reduction targets for Auckland Council, but Auckland City as a whole. So meeting our 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050 is an Auckland goal that Auckland Council are really on the hook to try and deliver. So, by starting to map out our Scope 3 emissions, we've been able to quickly identify our priority carbon areas of our supply chain, and we've started working with our suppliers to actively reduce our carbon footprints and supplier activities. So there's 3 basic principles that we are following to reduce carbon in our supply chain. This is around data, commitment, and collaboration. Data is fundamental. You need it to track and report year-on-year improvements, and you need to create good baselines against all of your contracts. With this information and the baselining, you can then start applying contractual KPIs where the commitment piece kind of kicks in. But we've also learned it's not just about kicking the can down to the supplier and making it their problem. We have to be working hand in hand with our suppliers, understanding their view of the world and where the opportunities exist, but also, identifying carbon innovation opportunities that we can cross-pollinate to other areas of our business. So just around the data piece quickly, we, to complement the Moata Carbon Portal, which is focused on embodied carbon, we have set up an operational carbon reporting platform as well called the Sustainability Data Capture Portal. We've got 15 suppliers and about 37 contracts feeding carbon and waste information into this portal on a monthly basis now, and that actually represents about 33% of our spend. So considering this has only been live for about 4 or 5 months now, it's a good start in the right direction to really understanding our Scope 3s. In conjunction with this reporting platform, we've also set up some community of practices working groups with our suppliers. And these are forums where we can come together, we bring our carbon and waste experts, we share ideas and innovations across the group and bring best practice thinking to our contracts. And then just thinking about actual carbon reduction in our projects, Auckland Council, we deliver over 3,500 projects every year of all shapes and sizes. Towards the very big end, projects like City Rail Link, and we've been having some really good successes, sustainability successes in using formal sustainability rating programs such as ISCA and Green Star ratings. The CRL program is an ISCA it's going through the ISCA certification process, and this obviously provides a really rigorous framework for sustainable outcome delivery, and also provides financial incentives and penalties for not meeting certain outcomes around employment, waste and carbon. And you can see how this would lead to a lot of innovation in design and construction. And just a couple of examples up there. So on the bottom left is a photo of the construction of a steel traffic deck, which has been built over the main trench just to allow temporary traffic flow during construction. Typically, at the end of the project, this would be chopped up and scrapped once the tunnel was completed. But in this instance, the designer, who I think was McConnell Dower, designed it in a way that made it really lightweight, so reduced a lot of the steel out of that deck in the first place, but also designed it in a way that made it easy to cut out and reuse. So some of these steel beams were reused on the next phase of the project, and some were used actually on a water care Hanua Dam rehabilitation project, which you can see in the bottom right photo. And the outcomes kind of speak for themselves on CRL to date. So they've had 98% diversion from landfill and over 4,100 tonnes of CO2 saved to date. And these are sort of setting new benchmarks for the industry that we're seeing in New Zealand. Equally, though, we need to be driving sustainability on our smaller projects where, you know, formal sustainability certification can't apply. I just put up this project, which is a recent project for all of our catering services across Auckland Council. And it's just a really good example of how, if you apply the right weighting and evaluation criteria to a sourcing project, you can deliver some pretty amazing outcomes. In this instance, I think we had a 20% weighting just on sustainability and sustainable outcomes. And that drove some really good thinking and responses from the market. The winning supplier who displaced the incumbent, actually, same price but better outcomes, really brought some really amazing commitments to the project. And this included, you know, a full rationalisation of all the food and packaging waste through our contract, but also working with a prison on a rehabilitation workforce program, and probably most importantly, the piloting of New Zealand's first refrigerated light truck EV, which you can see in the picture there, which, you know, is a small drop in the ocean, but the knock-on effects of establishing potentially a new vehicle market for this type of EV in New Zealand is pretty massive, right? And so then just thinking about our second environmental objective, which is about waste minimisation in our supply chain, which I've touched on a little bit already. We've got a pretty clear goal here, zero waste to landfill by 2040. But our waste is actually going in the other direction at the moment, which is unfortunate. There's lots of reasons why this is happening, but a really key one, I think, is the housing boom that we're experiencing and just the sheer amount of construction going on in our city. And, you know, I don't know if people know this or not, but around 40 to 50% of New Zealand's total waste comes from the construction industry. And if you've ever walked past like a local building site, you know that waste isn't generally maintained that well, or, you know, there's opportunities at least to reduce the waste. Just in the last 6 months, we've had 43,000 housing consents come through, and with every one of those houses having 4 to 5 tonnes of waste per house created, you can just see the magnitude of the program, of the problem, I should say. So what are we doing about it? Well, you know, it's a very complex problem that needs to be attacked from a number of different angles. There's a number of different things happening at a central level around landfill gate costs, product stewardship, which is cool to see. But there's also a number of opportunities that sit with us at a local government level. Firstly, we need to really move away from demolition to deconstruction and soft strip methodologies. And there's been a lot happening in this space in the last few years, which is great to see. I think 5 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, deconstruction was completely unheard of. From that, we've actually created a whole new industry with new suppliers, a lot of them Māori and Pacifica, with a really strong sustainability focus, to the point where, you know, it's starting to become the norm in industry. And Kainga Ora, for example, have completely abandoned their demolition panel and replaced it with a deconstruction panel, with sort of only half the incumbent suppliers actually retaining their services. So it's really cool to see how quickly this is moving. The second point as well is just around embedding waste minimisation in all our contracts. What we're trying to do here, in particular in construction, is, you know, mandate the use of a site-specific waste management plan on all construction projects. We're piloting at the moment on a number of different projects, and this is really about getting designers and contractors to really carefully plan for waste on their site, to make sure they know where all the waste that is leaving their site is going, and applying KPIs around waste diversion as well. A couple of other angles that we're taking. Innovation is really important. So there's a waste management innovation fund that Auckland Council set up, 500 grand worth of grants to great ideas how to reduce waste, with a particular focus in the construction industry for this grant round. We also need to create the right marketplace to reuse materials, right? So we've had a couple of attempts at this. Civil Share is getting a lot of traction, which is cool to see. And that's really a digital marketplace where builders can publish materials that they're going to otherwise throw away and see if there's a secondary market for this. And education is key as well, where it's talking about changing mindsets and behaviours of builders, which, you know, is a big task. And then lastly, you know, our objectives around social procurement. I mean, each one of these could be really a 2-hour presentation itself, but just to quickly touch on them. For supply diversity, this is really, from my perspective, about creating healthy markets where small businesses, and in particular Māori and Pacifica and social enterprise businesses, can really thrive. We know that they're underrepresented in our markets currently, and we know that they typically deliver more community impact for us than if we go to some of our tier 1 preferred suppliers. So it's just about finding the right opportunities for them to tender within council and reducing the barriers of entry for them to work with us. Quality employment is also just, it's a huge social lever, and I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what we can achieve in this space. We have done some amazing work with MSD in the last 12 months, and we've actually created, I think it was 355 job employment opportunities with MSD just in the last 12 months. But, you know, there's so much more we can do in this space, and it's really exciting when you start connecting them with other workforce programs, how quickly this comes alive really in procurement. And then lastly, it's the utilising more local suppliers and materials. We need to have a stronger local economy, but we also need more resilient local supply chains. So yeah, just to finish up, you know, I think we've moved far beyond asking ourselves, why are we doing this, to why aren't we doing these things? Why are we not seizing opportunities to create employment opportunities for people who are marginalised in the workforce? Why are we not insisting on our suppliers and contractors to really think and minimise their waste streams and carbon footprints? And, you know, in the next few years, we want to make sustainable procurement practices as business as usual in the industries we work with, as health and safety has become today. So we want sustainable procurement to be the new health and safety. And we want it to be a ticket to the game, in effect, to working with government and local government agencies. And I think we are on the right trajectory at the moment, which is great to see. So, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great speech. Really, really informative. We have had some very, very probing and challenging questions, so I hope you're ready.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen those come through.
Good. The first one, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the ISO 14K series. Leslie Stone.
Not very, no.
This question might fly a little bit over your head, but I'll put it through because I do find it quite interesting myself. So would it be useful to update the slides to reflect the changes in ISO 14064, which no longer includes scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? So this has changed to direct and indirect emissions with a focus on operational control. So this happened a few years ago, and people are still sort of reporting on the old framework, whereas Leslie's comment is that this has changed and we should be reporting in current best practice.
That's good feedback, and yes, perhaps I should. So yeah, thanks for that call out.
No worries. Peter Mitchell asked, until traditional procurement of infrastructure development and delivery places enhanced outcome value consideration, I fear that funding and costs will continue to perversely drive behaviour. In commas, it sounds like, you know, that's ultimately what your talk is talking to. I'm not sure if you have any additional comments on that comment.
Yeah, I mean, better sustainability at outcomes doesn't necessarily always equate to more cost, right? And there's a lot of evidence, in fact, that it doesn't. In some circumstances, it saves money. So waste, for example, there's been a lot of research about putting in proper early waste minimisation practices, and diversion from landfill doesn't cost any more in the total life cycle of that waste stream than if we just chucked everything in the landfill. And that equation is going to change significantly. And we think that waste landfill gate levies are going to increase by tenfold in the next sort of 15 years. So the mathematics that applies today for some of these things, same with carbon, right? The cost of carbon credits is absolutely skyrocketing. So some of the equations that apply today won't apply tomorrow. So just having that preparedness as well, not just thinking about the cost today, but the cost in 5 years' time of this is really important. And some of these other things like, the Napuna Pukenga partnership, which is a formal partnership between ourselves and the Ministry of Social Development, that's really geared around creating a win-win environment for us, for our contractors, and for the people themselves, and providing wraparound support, $9,000 worth of available training and funding, mentorship, pastoral care for these people, so everyone ends up winning, and it's not an additional cost to the contract at all. It's actually putting more money in our suppliers' hands to help train our people going forward.
It feels like you had the next comment in mind, which was around landfill gate costs. So they've only increased basically marginally here in New Zealand, whereas the UK, they've jumped significantly. So, they're up to $475 and $700 per ton, where we're up to about $60. So there is a stark difference. But I think what you're saying there in regards to increasing 10, 15 fold is, we're seeing that happening elsewhere. And yeah, I fully anticipate it will happen here and drive the right behaviours.
And you've seen those amazing graphs where you have the cost of the landfill gate rate versus the percentage of waste going to landfill versus and it's a completely linear line. And we're right at the bottom where we have very cheap landfill costs, but almost no diversion from landfill. So yeah, the government's fully, I think, aware of this. It's about how to transition that change.
Don't know how familiar you are with resource consent demands.
No, you've caught me in some of my weak spots.
No, I think I do know sort of where you're coming from. So I think that question might be a curveball on you. So we might glass pants that, but the suggestion is, as part of consent requirements, the consent requirements could mandate the deconstruction and relocation of homes and components rather than facilitating demolition through consent.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good call. Yeah.
Okay, and Peter, sorry, thank you. Peter just had a comment on that. He says what he was meaning was he thinks that a 20% weighting on sustainability evaluation may not be enough to make or break success. That's a really, really good comment.
I totally agree. That almost needs to be the bare minimum if you actually want sustainability in your projects. 20%. We've seen anything less than that, either suppliers don't take it seriously enough, or it just falls out in the mix and price still becomes king and you still get your cheaper supplier on the project. So yeah, fully agree with that.
And one last question, and it's a question is, the work that I've done sort of across New Zealand, it always comes down to what's the levers you can pull. So RC has asked, it says, apart from financial levers to change supplier and contractor behaviour, what else in your view can organisations use to positively, the questions are moving, positively encourage changes in the supply chain? So apart from procurement levers, what else could you do?
Yeah, I think we need to. I mentioned collaboration a couple of times, but we definitely need to be talking about this with the supplier on a constant basis. So working together at some of these construction bodies that we have is really important. Making sure it's a raised discussion topic there. We do a lot of work with our strategic suppliers in aligning our values and targets with their targets, not just on a project by project financial basis, but working at that strategic level with our partners, where we have these quarterly review sessions going, are your sustainability principles genuinely aligned with ours? Because they need to be if we're going to be strategic partners going forward. So yeah, you need to tackle it, I guess, at that sort of strategic level and a project level, and sort of everywhere in between. Yeah.
So, I think it brings us right back to Lee's, original presentation and her comment in terms of you can't monitor what you can't measure. And the way that I see it is, the entire supply chain is operated without having knowledge or need to have knowledge about carbon, considering the carbon impacts of the decisions. But as soon as you unveil an extra metric around a project beyond cost or time to start have carbon, then the way you look at things is slightly differently. So I think the Auckland Council initiative to bring a dashboard just to reveal the carbon impact of their decisions is going to be really, really unveiling and help drive the right behaviours simply by having transparency and measurement.
Yeah, totally agree.
We have come up on the hour mark, so I see a few people dropping off because back-to-back meetings and the likes. We'll spend just 10 minutes with any additional questions if you have any. So Lee and Olia, if you want to turn your webcams back on. If you do have any final questions, please send them through. I'll go back and see if I can pick some of the ones that we missed. There is an interesting one, Lee, around making carbon measurement or reporting to the carbon dashboard mandatory. Do you have any view or insight on that there?
I think in the future we're going to see a requirement to report these figures, and the legislation will be coming, eventually. So that could be a very real possibility.
And another one, in regards to dashboard access, is dashboard access available for the public to view? So
from our research, the public, they want to see what's going on, but and they will have the ability to go down into a certain level of detail. But I think the bigger picture that they're interested in is how it is impacting really their neighbourhoods, what's going on in Auckland. So that's the feedback we've gotten. They've given Auckland Council this clear mandate that we should be mitigating emissions, and we want to take them on this journey. So there will be they're definitely being incorporated into a layer of that dashboard, and we're just now working out how best to serve those residents.
Great. Yeah, I think the research you're doing in this space is amazing, and the engagement and the feedback that we've had from residents and as part of the Bloomberg initiative anyway, accelerating this has been really insightful. And I think an entire session on that would be really, really interesting, and every bit that I hear from it's amazing. Leslie Stone has a question. I'll read it out. I think I may have a go at answering it myself. So, has the carbon calculation tool been developed to be compatible with the need for continuous commissioning in construction projects? So I think it's worth, one of Lee's slides had this vertical diagram of the carbon dashboard pulling in multiple feeds from multiple locations. So you had a piece from carbon sequestration, which Olia's talking about. How do you understand the carbon you're removing? There was one from the operational carbon tool, which Chris will be fully across in regards to reporting on the electricity and the fuel you use as an organisation, and the electricity and the fuel is used by your supply chain. And lastly, there was the carbon calculation tool. So that is the Moata carbon portal. So that is working out the embodied carbon in infrastructure. So it's been designed to try and get an understanding as early as possible. So one of the graphs Lee had presented was when you can make the biggest impact on a project, which is as early as possible. So the carbon calculation tool is designed to give you as much insight as early as possible, but through sort of being able to adjust it at a more granular level, you can take it through from design through to construction and make granular adjustments to keep finding those carbon savings, and we're certainly seeing that out there. Okay. Peter, another question for Olia. So he says, is it algae? Algae? How do you pronounce A-L-G-A-E?
Algae.
Algae,
Depends
thank
where
you.
you're from.
Algae is a great for carbon capture, but results in the premature consumption of water quality, volume, and high whole-of-life costs at coastal wetlands, where the brackish water algae can also be a source of nuisance orders if near developments. I think it's probably an insight and comment. I'm not sure if you have anything to say on that one.
No, I suppose not. I guess it depends on how the wetlands be managed as well, how much accumulation there is going on of that. Yeah, it's not really what I'm looking at. I'm sure I'll come across it at some stage when I'm writing up.
Right. And one question from Alexander was, clearly from a city perspective, a holistic approach is needed, but there should be more areas outside the cities left alone as wilderness. Could nature recover itself if the human populations retreat a bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the whole idea behind managed retreat with, wetlands that have been drained. They will recover by themselves as sea levels rise. Those salt marshes, they'll start growing back, and that's already happening in some areas. In the Bay of Plenty, some people have left some farmland that's quite low lying, and the marshes are coming back.
Great. And Chris, this just the classical question, but sort of what you were speaking to, but how do we reconcile the challenges of procurement managers being charged with reducing costs for the organizations as their primary responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to my other point that sustainability outcomes doesn't necessarily mean extra cost, but yeah, it is difficult, right? It's just finding, there is a natural tension there sometimes, and it's finding the right balance. But also, what I've seen work is just focusing on one or two, looking at the procurement at hand and what are the one or two really good sustainability outcomes we can drive out of this. Not trying to boil the ocean and aim for 7 different priorities around water quality, blah, 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 blah. I think just being really simple with our approach seems to work quite well at the moment. So, yeah, it's a difficult one, but it's always moving as well. To be honest, it's not a static thing. Our paradigm of cost versus sustainability outcomes, I think that's even starting to shift every day, so yeah.
I think one thing worth alluding to is the graph that Lee had presented is from the origin of it is from the Infrastructure Carbon Review, which is 8 years old now, from 2013, where they looked at what would the impact of infrastructure for the carbon footprint of the UK. It was commissioned by the UK Treasury. And the overarching headline that came out of the study was reduce carbon, reduce costs. They realized that the carbon is a good measure of effort, rather that's material use, and the scope of it. And if you looked at reducing carbon, it wasn't about the substitution of, alternatives. It was about really challenging the need for it and using the existing infrastructure as much as you can. So they found where you had carbon savings, you quite often had capital savings. It's just looking at it through a new lens. So the Infrastructure Carbon Review is free to go and get online. And they actually had a really interesting piece just this year called the Infrastructure Carbon Review 7 years on. So they went back and looked at sort of the research they've done and how the industry has responded. So quick Google, and we can send a link out, and people have a read of that there. It's quite interesting. And one last question from Leslie was, I think it's for you, Chris. A major contributor to construction waste is the way quantity surveyors include, a standard practice, overestimation and therefore procurement of materials. So solutions need to include the regulations to eliminate this.
I gave that comment a big thumbs up when I read it.
Is that your thumbs up? Awesome. Couldn't agree more. Yep, totally. And yeah, you often see it where people don't work to standard sizes. It'll be there to fit the site or something to fit a design ethos. But once you take around what comes off the shelf, when you start designing to those measurements, then you start to eliminate waste and you get streamlined procurement, quicker construction. And this is the the prefabrication argument, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you very much. I think one last question from Adam Weller. Where does one find the Auckland Council procurement goals and actions that you mentioned, Chris?
So that's on our website. So hopefully if you just Google Auckland Council Sustainable Procurement, it'll come up. We've also got our FY21 results published on there as well. So right. Yeah, just have a quick navigation around, but it'll be there.
Amazing. The Lauren, who has kindly organised this and overseen ourselves, has recorded this session. So we will have a recording available, and we will distribute this. We'll try and include a link to Chris, and we'll get a link to the Sustainable Procurement Guidelines, and so people can see them. And I'll also send in the Infrastructure Carbon Review, so people can have a read as to the source of the information that Lee had presented around, the measure of carbon versus cost, and a link for this recording for anyone. So thank you everyone for your time. Really engaged session, great questions, great attendance. So thank you very much, and I hope you continue to attend the events going on as part of the Auckland Climate Festival. Have a great day and a great weekend, and we'll see you around.
Thanks,
Chris, Lee, Olia, thanks so much again for your great presentations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, everyone. Ka kite.
Cheers.